Welcome back to the second of two SY3 screencasts, introducing the role of the state. So in the last screencast we defined the state, we looked at the main institutions that make up the British state, and then we talked very briefly about the transition from the warfare state to the welfare state. So in this screencast we're going to continue where we left off in the last video by looking at the changing role of the British state since 1945. So the purpose of this screencast is to give you a broad historical overview of some of the main changes to the British state since the end of World War II. So as we mentioned at the end of the last screencast, in 1945 we started to see a big expansion in the role of the state. So the warfare state gave way to the welfare state. And this reflected a post-war consensus that the state should play a bigger role in people's social lives, that the state had a responsibility to help the poor, to redistribute wealth and income, to provide public services, to provide social security, to provide housing and full employment. And although these types of ideas were perhaps most keenly felt by the Labour Party, this post-war consensus or agreement about an expanded role for the state was shared by both Labour governments and Conservative governments in this post-war period. And the recent Ken Loach film, The Spirit of 45, offers a very sympathetic portrait of this post-war consensus. So as we can see in this diagram, the period from 1945 up until the end of the 1970s was a period of state expansion and a period that saw the growth in what we tend to call the welfare state. And the dominant political ideology, the dominant set of ideas and beliefs that influenced these policies was a left-of-centre political ideology called social democracy. And we'll be looking at political ideologies more closely a little bit later on in the course. For now, just be aware that social democracy is a perspective that believes in a big role for the state in providing things like welfare and public services. And they believe that it's the job of the state to redistribute wealth and income towards people who are less well off. Now, the 1970s was a politically and economically turbulent time for the UK, and therefore during this decade some politicians on the right begin to question the post-war social democratic consensus. And in 1979 we see the election of a Conservative government led by a radical new Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher in 1979 clearly signalled her intention to break away from the social democratic consensus by declaring that I am not a consensus politician, I'm a conviction politician. So although the role of the state in social and economic life had been massively expanded during the post-war period, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, her mission was to try to roll back the state, to try to reduce the role of the state, particularly in terms of economic management. And she set about doing this by reducing taxes for the wealthiest Britons, by removing state subsidies from inefficient British companies, and by embarking upon a process of selling off publicly owned state industries such as the National Coal Board, the Water Board, British Telecom, etc. Okay, a process that is known as privatisation. And a similar process to this also went on in the 1980s in America under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And these two governments that shared a lot in common, Thatcher in Britain, Reagan in America, are sometimes referred to as the New Right, and their guiding political ideology was a perspective called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a perspective that argues that because individuals are rational beings, the role of the state should be kept to a bare minimum. In other words, they argue that the state that does least is best. In other words, rational individuals do not need big governments taxing them or telling them how to behave. So as we can see on this summary diagram, compared to the post-war period, the period from 1979 to 1997, a period of unbroken conservative governments, was a period of state contraction rather than state expansion. And this was marked by things that I've already mentioned, such as the privatisation of state industries, the selling off of council houses, taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals being lowered. And this was also a period where the economy was deregulated, including significant deregulation of the financial services industry. And of course, this deregulation of the banking sector, what is sometimes referred to as the Big Bang, has been one of the contributing factors to the recent global banking crisis. Now, under the leadership of Tony Blair, the Labour government that came to power in 1997, after 18 years of Conservative government, committed itself to a so-called third way style of politics and state intervention. So the third way approach that guided the state under the leadership of Tony Blair was an attempt to combine elements of both neoliberalism, this right-wing approach pioneered by Margaret Thatcher, and the more traditional left-wing social democratic approaches. So it was an attempt to synthesize elements of both ideologies. In other words, the third way tries to find a middle course between left-wing and right-wing ideologies. So, for example, after 1997, the Labour government invested heavily in public services such as education and healthcare, and this might be considered to be a traditionally left-wing position to take. However, unlike previous Labour governments in the past, Labour after 1997 were also keen to involve private companies in the running of these public services, an approach that we would more traditionally recognise as being right-wing. For example, in relation to education, the Labour government started to set up academies, which were schools that were sponsored and managed by private companies that had been set up to replace so-called failing schools that were previously controlled by the local council. Another really important change to the role of the state introduced by Labour under the leadership of Tony Blair was devolution. And devolution is an issue that we'll explore in a lot more detail later on in the course, but it involved the setting up of new parliaments and assemblies to represent different regions of the UK, including a Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, a National Assembly for Wales based in Cardiff, a Northern Ireland Assembly in Belfast, and a Greater London Authority and directly elected London Mayor. In other words, Labour introduced new state institutions in between the levels of the UK Parliament and local government, local councils. So there were unbroken Labour governments from 1997 to 2010, and this was a period of state expansion, at least in terms of the amount of money that was invested in public services, although, as I've previously noted, sometimes the delivery of these public services was actually left to the private sector. Also, in order to try to ensure that this extra investment in public services actually improved the quality of public service, Labour governments during this period introduced a very complex audit culture of targets, quotas and plans to try to ensure accountability. So in May 2010, a new government was formed in the UK, and as the result of the general election was a hung parliament, remember that describes a situation where no single party has an overall majority in the House of Commons, The Conservative Party, which were the largest party in Parliament, formed a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats. And for this coalition government, deficit reduction, in other words, reducing the size of government debt, has been the most pressing and urgent priority. And government debt has grown exponentially as a result of the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Now, the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 is widely seen by economists as the most serious financial crisis since the Great Depression, and it's a crisis that casts a long shadow over British politics and the role of the state. And this global financial crisis has its long-term roots in decisions taken over the last 25 years or so to deregulate banks and financial markets, which have made it easier for banks to engage in reckless and irresponsible behaviour. And the trigger for this financial crisis was the inappropriate lending strategies adopted by US banks and mortgage companies. So these banks, rather than investing in industries and businesses that would have produced long-term returns for the American economy, deliberately shifted their focus towards lending money to people who were either bad credit risks or easy victims. And high-risk loans to mortgage applicants with either poor or non-existent credit histories, the so-called subprime market, could not realistically be paid back in the long term. And the scale of this toxic debt led to shockwaves and a crisis in confidence in financial institutions in America and beyond. And governments around the world have had to spend billions of dollars bailing out large banks that otherwise would have gone under. And this, of course, means that the bad debts of banks have been transferred to the state, and this has put pressure on governments around the world to either increase taxes or reduce public spending. And in the UK, the decision of the coalition government has been to prioritise reducing public spending rather than raising taxes. And this graph is from the International Monetary Fund, and what it shows is projected government spending as a percentage of national GDP. And what the IMF have found is that projected public spending in the UK by the middle of this particular decade will be lower than any other developed economy. And the decision to prioritise the reduction of public spending rather than tax rises perhaps reflects, once again, the popularity of this neoliberal perspective, which is opposed to big government, the welfare state, high taxes, etc. And if we look at the policies being pursued by the current coalition government, particularly their attitude towards welfare, it seems to reflect this kind of neoliberal idea that the state that does least is best. So since 2010, in response to government debt caused by the banking crisis, we've seen this age of austerity where the government is trying to reduce its debt now by reducing the amount that it spends on things like welfare.